After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Hey, listeners. Happy New Year and welcome back to another episode here at Greenhouse Gaslighting. I know you may be wondering, what exactly do me and Josh have to talk about when we're only 11 days into the goddamn year, but the speaker business, what can be said about it?
I mean, there's a lot to be said. So, for those who have not been living under a rock or possibly living in another country that's not Brazil,
If you haven't been occupied by the electric stove versus gas stove debate.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's the real reason we're here today, folks. We're gonna pivot to talking about the stove. Personally, I'm partial to the Franklin stove. We got to bring that back into the mainstream. But no, so obviously, yeah, the speaker vote. So the United States House of Representatives, pretty much anytime a new Congress comes into play, right? So January 3rd is when they're sworn into session. They, elect a speaker, and this process for the past, ironically enough, literally, the past 100 years has been probably, I would say, generally non-controversial. Very little ripples and whatnot. When I talked about this with my class on Tuesday, which was the first, day of the semester and whatnot, who knows, maybe I'll refer them to this episode too if they really want a deep dive. But yeah, so for the past 100 years, this process has just been pretty straightforward, right? It's, the majority party has a coalition that, is obviously the majority, right? It has a majority of seats in the chamber, and they elect a speaker. This process followed that up till, January 3rd, in the sense that both caucuses had voted on who their candidates would be. Democrats elected Hakeem Jeffries, and of course, they're the minority party. He has realistically no shot at winning, but there was enough belief this time around that there might be enough chaos for him to get through, and Republicans elected McCarthy with a few holdouts for that nomination. By the time they actually voted for speaker, those holdouts kind of grew, right? And so the first ballot, Kevin McCarthy only gets 203 votes. Hakeem Jeffries got 212, which meant he, had more votes, but you need to get that 218 to actually get the majority, or if people vote present, that lowers the necessary threshold you need to secure the majority.
Yeah, and I think in that first ballot, actually, hang on.
He had 203 votes, first ballot.
Yes. I was just trying to see how many present votes there were, but I think the present votes don't show up until the fourth ballot. I got the Wikipedia pulled up. It is CNN primetime over here, folks. So I know I intended to maybe ask this question a little later on in our discussion, but maybe it's a good time to ask this now. Because one of the prescient reactions people were having online about this was, is it always this chaotic, or does it tend to fall into this many rounds? So I did want to ask, is there a precedent for this kind of chaotic speaker vote? Are there past examples similar to this?
Yeah, so I mean, new? the first one was the one that kind of, that 100 years ago one, right? 1923, the U.S. Speaker election there, that was contentious for a number of reasons, right? And in general, the further back we go, there's a little bit more contention in these for a number of reasons that I'll get into. But in 1923, the reason that contest went to 9 ballots, not the grand total of 15 we got out of Kevin McCarthy. That was because of a few things, right? So that Congress, Republicans were in the majority again, though the Republican Party of that era is quite different from the one we have now. But the issue was that they still maintained a majority that they had the prior Congress, the 1991 and 1921 to 1923 one. They maintained a majority, but they lost around 70-ish seats, right? So a pretty big loss, right? I mean, that's different from this time where they actually, gained the majority that they, didn't have before. But in addition to that, Congress also worked differently as far as the schedule was concerned. So the votes ended up happening in December. they had previous like caucus meetings to kind of discuss this beforehand. But in the interim as well, you have the president of the United States, who was a Republican at the time. What was it? Harding at that point, I believe. He dies, and his choice was Frederick H. Gillett, who was the incumbent at the time, anyways. But he dies, so like that sort of opens the door for like this rebellion, right? And you get a rebellion from like the progressive Republican wing of the party, kind of helmed up by Henry A. Cooper. He holds out, never really surpasses like 20 votes. So kind of similar to this time around, right, where they sort of just kept throwing names out there to kind of see. I don't know if they really had intended to like see if anything would stick, or if they were just determined to get McCarthy to just say, "All right, I'm done," weed himself out into the sunset. But that was the precedent there. And then before that, this was the first time in, I believe, 150 so years where you had going past 9 ballots, right? And this is a pretty unprecedented thing, and relatively in like the modern era and whatnot. But in the Civil War era, like the pre-Civil War era, the speakership was a lot more contentious. And like that kind of is for a number of reasons, right? Like first is of course like the issue of slavery, right? I mean, like anytime you talk about the 1800s or like the mid to early 1800s in American politics, it kind of always comes back to that issue, right? It's just sort of this standard bread and butter. So that's one of the things, but it kind of created this weird regional divide, right? Where there's a difference between what a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat believes,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
They're not necessarily the same thing. You also had different political parties at the time. The Whigs were sort of I guess you could call them like the Democratic opposition. The Democrats kind of had a pretty strong hold on Congress and whatnot through like pretty much from Jackson till like the Civil War.
Yeah, the Whigs were a weird formation, like this, because this is back in an era where regionalism determined things more than ideology.
Yeah,
So
and I mean, like, and like ideology, like, kind of as like from like the modern construct of it, is sort of tied to those regions a bit. Where your ideology is sort of informed by that. But yeah, like the region definitely matters a lot more, as you said. Um, but yeah, so like you have that, and you also have like for a brief time you have other parties like the Know Nothings parties or like the
right.
Natural Law Party, all these like kind of weird groups that sort of exist. And they kind of, they make it harder to sort of get that majority coalition you need to secure a speaker anyways, right? Because you have to sort of form what an idea that was kind of flirted here a little bit was, the idea of a coalition government, which is more of like a parliamentary thing, right? Where you sort of have to like kind of agree to sort of share seats and power and whatnot. So that was a little bit more necessitated back then just because of the more broken nature of things. There are a few other parallels to the Civil War era as well. There was threats of violence, the speaker vote. That was quite common back then as well. Um, I don't know if I would quite jump on the kind of historian bandwagon that I've seen where like, oh, hey, this is really bad because like these things happened leading up to the Civil War, ergo new Civil War. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I mean, it's again another sign of just, the divisiveness of like the modern political era.
Yeah, and like I know like it's kind of like a pop history thing to be like, oh, the last time a speaker vote took this long was prior to the Civil War. Ooh, but I mean, the smarter take, if anything exists, right, is like both times, this most recent one and that time, stressed the limitations of the system really for different reasons. The first one being that you have two committed factions, one against slavery and one for it, trying to build a society that dictates that. And in this case, we have, our system not able to kind of cohere around two different sides of a culture war expressed in partisan conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that it's like the underlying motivations of the group is different, right? I mean, and not
Mhm.
to defend like those antebellum, pro-slavery
Not at all,
parties and whatnot,
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like not to defend them, but they at least had some type of policy conviction and whatnot. And I mean, and there's some stuff here that you get out of the Republicans that were holding out, the Gates faction, the Freedom Caucus faction, whatever. I mean, the Freedom Caucus was a bit divided here.
Mhm.
You get some of that, but really it's like you're in the majority of the House, but you don't control the Senate or the presidency. So like earnest policy objectives don't really matter. And it's interesting too, where I was seeing the intellectual cruiserweights of the right, like Ben Shapiro and whatnot, kind of complaining about how this is embarrassing, this is humiliating, and there did seem to be a little bit of a divide
Mhm.
in your talking heads in terms of what makes more sense. Do we just settle for McCarthy? Do we fight him? Whatever. But overall it's like all of them sort of agreed that the fundamental job of the Republicans in the House is basically just to impede and block the Democratic agenda. And fundamentally, you don't need a speaker for that, right? If Congress,
Mhm.
this without the speaker, there's no rules committee, and therefore there's no rules. So Congress was, for about a week, had no rules. That's why you kind of saw like people who weren't from Congress just hanging out on the floor. Justin Amash of Michigan threw his hat in the ring, and he was hanging out in Congress, which I
Mhm.
thought was a little sad. I thought it was more so just working a bit, but actually showing up there showed that he might have been a little bit
And
more genuine in his pleas than anyone realistically should be. Uh, but like it was also kind of controlled how like the C-SPAN cameras were used as well. Though it looks like they might be used the same way going forward. There's restrictions usually when there's rules in session, but because Congress
mhm.
hadn't had those, there was a little bit more candid observations that were on C-SPAN that I think the internet, certainly on Twitter, had a lot of fun with. But
Definitely, we thank the C-SPAN camera operators for their service in these
oh,
difficult
for
times.
sure, yeah. But my overall point there, right, is that like fundamentally, if there's a speaker who's there to sort of like literally be like the tome wielder of like we're just obstructing everything, or you just don't have a house that works, it doesn't really matter. At least as far as like that political objective, right? I think long term, like political consequences, particularly electoral consequences. I mean, there is a difference there, and I don't necessarily buy that this will, really hurt them in 2024. But it's definitely, I think, a symptom of stuff that will hurt them.
I agree with that assessment. So I'm gonna cannibalize a couple of the questions I have here on the outline together, really with this. So Kevin McCarthy has been a perennial candidate for Speaker in the Republican caucus, if I understand. I think the last time he tried to run for something and lost was, I think, was it Boehner?
Yeah, so Boehner had stepped down, or he might have had some role before that, but he was kind of like Boehner's lieutenant. And when Boehner
Yeah.
had stepped down as the majority leader, McCarthy's sort of the natural speaker elect, right? And that was a weird period. I know there's a lot of like
Yeah, because then Paul
basically
Ryan got it for something, or wasn't it?
yeah, it was that Paul Ryan's the one who ended up with it after that. It wasn't even really so much a battle, right? It was like Boehner had stepped down because basically the reasons why this happened, right? He had kind of lost control over the further right wing portion of the caucus and
Mhm.
didn't like being speaker anymore, so he stepped down, resigned, and retired from Congress.
Basically
Um,
cashed out, yeah.
yeah, basically, cash went into, I was going to say the weed industry, but cannabis is the politically correct term, and the one that he uses now. So
Oh wow. Oh wow.
that was that was a transformation and a half, right? Like definitely one of the people who I'm sure has a pretty anti marijuana record in Congress, but ended up doing that. But yeah, so McCarthy got passed over, and I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, there's like conspiracies as to why, right? Like there was belief that was like, oh, there was going to be like an affair that was exposed. He had kind of gone through like the media gauntlet and like had of among other things exposed, quote unquote, that Republicans had the Benghazi committee just to hurt Hillary Clinton. Which very shocking stuff that I'm sure was really groundbreaking for the
Yeah,
time.
I'm really wondering who was shocked by that. I'm
Yeah, I mean, it was like one of those things where it's like, oh man, mask off, but it's like, it's like, there's a, I don't know, it's like a mask off if like, I don't know, like if the mask was just like a caricature of his face and he just ripped it off. That's basically what it
It's
is.
like if
Like,
you really believe the Republicans like operate in good faith, this is probably a shock to you. But anyone who sincerely believes that, come on, come on.
yeah, exactly. And so, anyways, so McCarthy was passed over. That was kind of all behind the scenes, though, right? It wasn't like it had come to a vote and he was humiliated in as epic of a fashion, or even in a less epic fashion, as what we got here. So yeah, that was one thing where like, it was kind of, it was, there was always signs that he was a weak candidate, right?
And he has this reputation of being kind of dopey in interviews and stuff, or at least like during Boehner's term, and even like during various interviews, and then through this voting process, he never seemed like an overeager dope. But he was always just like a, yeah, they're calling me a dork, and I don't even know they're calling me a dork kind of energy.
Yeah, I mean he's a weird fellow. Like I mean that's probably like the best way to describe him. I know like I mean I saw like Tucker Carlson called him like politically agnostic, which I don't really buy, but I mean I think like I mean when the right wing says someone's politically agnostic, they just kind of mean that they're like they're not
He,
committed to some like
he didn't drink enough of the Kool-Aid, or he didn't
yeah,
enjoy.
like they're
Yeah,
not like that committed to like,
he
the
didn't do the
craziest parts of the agenda.
well. It's I think it really is just the establishment at this point in the Republican Party is who does less jug hooting.
Yeah, and I think like, of like I mean, I don't even know if I feel weird calling him part of the establishment wing of the party. But
Yeah.
like of the people in I guess that wing of the party, he's definitely the one who's the most willing to sell out. And that's exactly, what happened here, right? I mean, like even prior to like actually securing the speakership, he, is like there with like Marjorie Taylor Greene every step of the way because
Mhm.
he sees her as like the best path to like actually like bringing the rest of these Freedom Caucus people on board. He's there with like his acceptance speech for when he's finally the speaker is like thanking Donald Trump, literally on the the day after January 6th. uh it's and like all this stuff that like it's and it's interesting because like fundamentally the reason why this battle was contentious in the first place, for multiple reasons, is because of the 2022 election, right?
Mhm.
Republicans didn't necessarily get enough of a majority to just secure his vote in on the first time without those holdouts. And people were kind of incentivized to hold out on him because they didn't do so well. But part of the reason he didn't do so well is because of a lot of those members, right? Like Boebert almost lost her election, and you have a lot of other candidates there too who are just kind of or members that are just kind of like it's like their brand of politics were kind of firmly rejected in large parts of this country, right? Abortion was a major issue, and they're all pro-life, and their position was firmly rejected, and numerous other things like that. And kind of tying yourself so closely to the brand of the far right is definitely going to like any like plausible deniability that he had going for them is pretty much gone.
And that's something I'm trying to understand at a technical level too, right? Which is like barring ideological goals, which is what drives them. Like I don't really think they got to extract any concrete concessions from this vote. Did anyone get any kind of like favorable committee assignment out of this,
Um,
or
I'll have to look at the exact committee assignments. They did get 3 people on the rules committee, which
okay?
kind of helps them kind of enshrine a lot of the rules they were pursuing. Matt Gaetz notably said, "I ran out of things I could even imagine to ask for," which is like I can imagine quite a
Jesus.
lot. I don't know what that means exactly. Um, and I'll have to see who's on. He was on the intelligence committee, right?
Something like that, I recall.
Yeah, I'll have to look at these committee assignments exactly because I'm curious because there was the belief that because he's on the same committee as maybe it's on intelligence, um, but he's on the same committee as Mike Rogers of Alabama, not the former member Mike Rogers from Michigan.
Mhm.
Because he had threatened him on the floor, right? And he's on the same committee as him, and the belief was that he might have secured his gavel for switching to president, which is like, man, like not even like voting for McCarthy, but just like allowing this process to end is enough to secure like favorable positions is pretty wild. It's the Armed Service Committee. Let me check that.
Which what was the exact threat made?
Well, he
I
like had like reached over to like try to attack him.
what?
Like,
I
he-
mean,
that's like,
there was all kinds of bad behavior on display. What was that? Was it like one member like vaping on the floor too, but trying to hide it?
oh yeah, I think there was that too. I mean, the people, and again, like it's there's the lack of rules, lack of decorum. Uh, and like, I don't know. It's weird, right? Like, is there some benefit to seeing members vape? Like, I mean, I don't. It's not a habit I particularly see value in, I guess, like for lack of a better term. But like, it's one that like like okay, like people do this, right? Is that like I don't know, is that something? I don't know.
It,
Like is that like does it make these people seem more relatable? I
I
don't
think
know.
it's less about the relatability thing and more of like it's like what we were trying to touch on with like our initial conversation with George Santos, right? Is that there's this veneer of respectability, professionalism,
Sure.
all that stuff, right? And these are the people that tend to, especially like conservatives, will lecture people on like young
What
people these days. You know what I'm talking about, right?
yeah, and like yeah, I guess that's true because I mean there's sort of that like idea of like I mean I feel like that was something that I feel like COVID put an end to, right? Just the idea of like, the business things where you all, get up, suit and tie dinners and stuff like that. I feel like that's all just like it feels like an artifact of the past. I think COVID was one nail in the coffin, but definitely like seeing these members make other fools of themselves
Right.
is another nail.
Yeah. And speaking of Gates, while we're trying to pull up his committee assignments and stuff, right?
Yeah, it doesn't look like he got like the gavel, so I don't know. I don't know what they got. Like, because again, like I mean, securing votes on certain things, right? Like their first vote was like quote unquote defunding the IRS. Like, well, like that doesn't actually do anything because it has to actually pass through other chambers, and that's not going to
Right.
happen. And again, like they're making a lot of these votes that are more or less entirely performative, right? Because they're basically they're shooting guns, but they're blanks, right? They don't have any real like they can do whatever they want without consequence here, except maybe the government shutdown, which normally I would say I don't necessarily know if I really see that like having like I don't think we're going to default on the debt, but like there's like somewhat of a fear there, right? Because I think even this process, right? I think like yeah, Gates had made like this whole fuss about he didn't want to vote for McCarthy. He has all these numbers of people that don't want to vote for McCarthy, but you kind of always like when you hear these people, you kind of just like yeah, like whatever, like Gates is at it again. Like he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like he doesn't, he's not really going to carry through with this. But they did carry through with it for quite some time. So how committed these people are is definitely I mean, it's interesting, but in like a very morbid way, where
Yeah,
it's like,
because
there's could be real consequences down the line.
yeah, but like as far as I can tell though, like I cannot name a single concrete benefit they got out of it. And then again, I'm just jumbling the outline here, but that one clip that came out from the alternative C-SPAN camera footage we've been seeing, right?
Hmm.
Of that suspicious whisper made to Matt Gaetz, and he went a little cold after that.
Oh yeah, with a nice little shoulder tap and whatnot. Yeah,
Yeah,
that was at the end of the 14th vote. That was right after Mike Rogers had to be restrained, pulled away from him. Uh, yeah, I mean that all kind of came about around the same time. Yeah, and it's interesting too, right? Because it's like oh man, there's still like even with C-SPAN, even with all these alternate like views and angles that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise, there's still that like intrigue and mystery about like what's actually happening and whatnot. What are the words being shared behind maybe not so closed doors.
yeah, I think like this is like the subtext floating around, and there's not like anything particularly juicy anyone can pick up on, unless they're trying to like really like get their imagination to a fever pitch. But I think like the lack of rules and seeing everybody like, you know, behaving poorly or people who you wouldn't expect to be talking, that veneer of respectability and this like myth that members of Congress themselves, you know, will pass around that like, well, you know, we all work together, we're all trying to compromise, blah blah, all of that, um, or that like, you know, people are honest. That veneer was kind of not necessarily eroded, but like kind of called into question, and it just looked to me like, oh, so we're just greasing palms and in public. In fact, you can do the motions of greasing palms because no one's hearing you say anything.
Yeah,
Now,
and it's interesting too because I know a lot of there's been a lot of like scholarly debate on the impact of C-SPAN and like particularly with discussions about like, you know, and I talk about this a little bit in my course as well over um you know, like does like having the cameras on make things a lot more performative, and like, you know, are certain speeches would they have even happened without that? Is there negative consequences to that in terms of like polarization and
mhm,
whatnot? And yet here it felt a little bit more candid in a lot of ways, right? Like definitely like, you know, AOC talking with Matt Gaetz and Paul Gosar. That's not really the kind of thing that feels like, oh, this is just because the cameras are on. So
right,
it was interesting this process, seeing it be more like, I don't know. I mean, genuine makes it sound like, you know, more warm and fuzzy than I think it really is. But, you know, there was a little bit more of that like actual take of like, this is maybe a little closer to what, you know, life in the chamber might look like.
right,
Where like these
right.
people, and even like, I mean, like the Paul Gosar thing was particularly surprising just because like he's like the guy who, you know, nearly has committee assignments removed because he had like, you know, posted a meme of like killing AOC. Like a little weird
Right.
seeing them have a rather casual looking conversation. So, you know, again, like some of it's like, you know, like the stuff like the meme is more so when the cameras are on, where this felt like a little bit more like the cameras were off, except this time they weren't.
Indeed. So, like we talked about this last year, and I'm trying to figure out how much of this will hold true. And granted, we're only 11 days into the new year, so like I'm not sure how long this can hold up. But how solid of a hold do you think McCarthy's going to have over the Republican caucus in the House?
Virtually non-existent.
Hmm.
You know, and like, and this is the thing too, where like, and I think like part of the belief going into this that this would not be like a real meaningful battle is because no one really wants to be the speaker. And like you were looking at like, you know, the other candidates. I mean, like initially it was like, oh, like they're kind of rallying behind like Jim Jordan. Well, that didn't really last, right? Because I mean, like one, Jim Jordan was voting for McCarthy anyways, but it just didn't really last. Then they kind of rallied behind Byron Donalds, and that largely just seemed to be like a, you know, tap on the back because he finally defected. So it's like let's vote for him, and he's going to vote for himself. So like, why not? Um, but and to be fair, when he was nominated, I kind of thought they just straight up made someone up. I didn't think he. I was like, who the fuck is this guy? Um, then, you know, Gates tried to get like a Trump vote going, which I was surprised that ended as like much of a failure as it did. Then a few people started nominating like someone like Kevin Hearn, which was largely just as a vindictive joke because they could say Kevin and
Right.
then not say McCarthy. I don't think it had anything to do with like a legitimate interest in him serving as speaker. Um, and you know that's like all like, you know, it's like, and you know the reason they don't want to serve as speaker, right, is because this is what they have to deal with on every vote, most likely, or maybe not every vote, but on a lot of them, right? You know, like they have to be, you know, kind of kowtow to this right wing, and that will make them make like the really far right wing, and that'll make them make costly mistakes for like members, you know, across the ballot, right? You know, when they're, you know, glued to, I mean, when people say there's no moderate Republicans, if, you know, like this makes it look rather true, right? You know, when you're sort of like, yeah, like I'm going to take a selfie of Marjorie Taylor Greene on the way to, you know, accepting the speaker's gavel and things like that. And, you know, like one of their concessions was actually kind of meaningless, all things considered, but it was this, adoption of a single member motion to vacate, which is basically one member can make a motion to basically start a vote of no confidence in a parliamentary system, right? So just oust the speaker. Uh, the little hidden detail of this is that it was previously a 5-member motion, which does that really make a huge difference? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but that that's going to get pulled the minute he does something, like the minute they cave in on like ending a shutdown or something, McCarthy's out.
Mm-hmm. And that also just had me thinking, right? Like, aside from maybe like the symbolic prestige of the position, I don't really think you get to wield a lot of influence or even like a positive public opinion unless your party holds the majority, right? And it would need to be sizable in some capacity. Like in this gridlocked state, if anything, you're the easiest member of the House to point towards for dysfunction, if that makes sense.
100%. And I mean, even I think Pelosi was probably, all things considered, a pretty good speaker. And I know a lot of people have issues with her, kind of on all sides of the aisle.
From an
right?
institutional perspective, though, I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
exactly.
like from an institutional perspective, she was pretty good, right? She and even like from a like political perspective, right? I mean, I think she from the left, she did support at least some things that people wanted, and like maybe those things wouldn't have happened without someone from an institutional perspective like her. And she was someone that was like kind of wielded like institutionally strong influence, right? And yeah, there was issues with that, right, where people had in terms of like kind of from a like anti small d democratic sense, right, where individual members were kind of disenfranchised relative to the speaker, because there's limitations on how many amendments they can propose and things like that. A lot of like kind of this I don't want to say inside I mean, like it's the bread and butter of like how like you actually get legislation, right? That's the stuff that the speaker is kind of key to, right? And it seems like in McCarthy's case, he's really depowered the speakership, both from Pelosi, but also from even like Boehner, and certainly from like the likes of Hassert and Gingrich. And and again, like a lot of these Republican speakers lately, they've been leaving in disgrace, right? Gingrich was basically ousted by his own party. Hassert was outed as a child molester. And Boehner, Boehner kind of went off in the sunset. What?
Paul Ryan didn't last long either, did he?
No, Ryan was barely there. I mean, I was like, he kind of had like a slightly more graceful exit, but yeah, he was only there for like a few years. I think 2 terms. But he was, you could already see like the writing on the wall, right? They were going to lose the majority before he resigned, or retired rather, and didn't run for a re-election. And Trump was already kind of like on his throat, right? Like he knew that like this was, and again, like too, right? In the Republicans' positions, right? You have that large specter of a man in the background, right? Donald Trump is still, and like again, McCarthy himself attributed his victory of speakership to Donald Trump. There's the C-SPAN footage of Marjorie Taylor Greene like on the phone with Trump, handing it to other members to try to get them to change their vote. Like literally that direct lobbying just to get McCarthy in. And the minute he does something that like isn't like Trump approved, there's a problem for him. Or there's a problem for, if someone else replaces McCarthy midterm or anyone else, right? The speaker is, in a particularly problematic position, I think, within like the modern Republican Party, but especially one where like you have such a narrow majority.
Yeah, and like that's what's been tricky to determine in like our discussion of like what even is the establishment in the Republican Party at this point, right? Because Trump aligned or not, they're all taking money from the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, all the usual players. But the only like policy requirement is to demonstrate a symbolic fealty to Trump, and then you get more clout the more photo ops you get with him, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, like outside of that, like I don't think Trump is as necessarily like as much of like a culture war. I mean, he's definitely probably like a ground zero of the culture war in a lot of ways, but
Right.
I don't think he necessarily demands so much when it comes to like actions being taken for the culture war, right? Other than like the preservation of himself. But
Hmm.
one of these bills where they're like, kind of defunding the wokeness of the military, like whatever the hell that means. Yeah, and weird performative gestures like that. That I just, it's really strange where it's like it's not clear. Like, and I get again, like this is kind of like when they were elected, right? Everyone pointed out that like they didn't really campaign on clear policy positions. Here they are, sort of empowering government, at least in one chamber. And again, the actual policy, when it comes down to it, is either like borderline insane or it's unclear and like just the most like vague stuff imaginable.
Yeah, and like the funny thing about Trump being ground zero for the culture war in a way, right, is like the whole point is just that he pisses off the libs. That's the whole appeal.
Yeah.
He doesn't even have to lift a finger, actually. The whole theory of change, if they have one, I mean, they fundamentally want nothing to change, let's be honest, is just to keep just to keep him around as like, I don't know, some kind of totem of power. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good like metaphor for it, right? It's like some weird like fixture or totem of power. Um yeah, and I think you're right. Like, it's kind of like, how much of him, like how much value do they really get out of him now other than just like he owns the libs? I mean, there's some like race issues and whatnot where I think that like that's relatively consistent on the culture war. But even then, like I mean, not to like follow like the theory that he's actually like really great for the gays or whatever. Like they sometimes like to argue, but like he doesn't have nearly as like fundamentalist of a position on a lot of these social issues that a lot of the Republicans in Congress and kind of in like these thought leaders in the Heritage Foundation and outside of
Exactly.
it, like he definitely lacks that level of commitment to those particular issues.
Yeah, it's like it's basically whoever um sings his praise the loudest gets to
Yeah.
work under him, but they personally have to be enterprising enough to seek those levers under him.
Well, and look at how, Gates and a lot of these people who were voting against McCarthy, even though Trump had endorsed him, look at how they talked about it, right? They're like, I love Trump. He's my favorite president. But that tells you how much I hate McCarthy, that, like, I'm willing to defy him for this one purpose. This is the only thing I'm willing to do to ever, disgrace my Pope, is to vote against McCarthy. Or, like, I think Gates even specifically said that, like, only mistakes Trump ever made were, like, personnel ones. And this is just the latest example of that.
Yeah, the personnel were not mistakes. The personnel were the one who kissed the right asses. That's really it.
Well, sometimes someone kisses your ass and then stabs you in the back, right? It's
Fair enough.
it's the circle of life.
Oh God. I mean, that's the thing is like McCarthy could have probably held more sway over the coalition at this point. Um, either with giving everyone their dream committee assignments, which is impractical, or just like getting ahead of the competition with a photo op with Trump, basically.
And yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe the fact that like the most notable one he had was the one like right after January 6th, before like the first time around, but like, it's maybe he needed a more recent one. I don't know. It's weird. I think in the case of McCarthy, it's just fundamentally unlikable.
Yeah, yeah, like
Like, like when they were talking about his strategy, I mean, and his strategy, like, let's face it, there's I'm about to use some like hard political science jargon to describe McCarthy, but he's a dumbass. Like his whole strategy was, we're just going to keep voting and eventually they will cave. And that's sort of what happened, right? I mean, like, there was a lot of concessions supposedly and whatnot. We don't know the full scope of them, and whether or not they were meaningful, right? And even then, right? Like, I don't know why you couldn't just concede, like, yeah, we're gonna have this vote on like some asinine policy that's not going to get through the Senate, right? Like, there's no cost to that. other than like its position taking, and maybe that's deadly, but like I don't think that the Republican Party really conceives like position taking as like remotely negative, right? I think they see it as all positive. Um, because I don't think they really are that interested in swaying moderates anymore. But he's fundamentally, as I just think he's like fundamentally unlikable, and that was like the reason why Democrats were lockstep with Hakeem Jeffries. I think one was symbolic to show that they function as a party while the Republicans don't. But it's a lot easier to do that in the minority than is in the majority. Anyways, but I think that's like one thing. But also like when there was discussion about like a coalition speaker, they're like, let's bring back Fred Upton, who retired, to lead it. Justin Amash volunteers himself for it. No one takes it seriously. But oh, let's try to find some moderate Republican. No one's like, oh, what can McCarthy do to maybe get a few Democrats to vote for him? Because no one on that side likes him. The people on his side, you kind of get, and there a number of them, more or less, even the people who voted for him every time, more or less imply that like if this keeps going, I'm not going to vote for him. Because let's just give Steve Scalise or someone else a shot. Just work our way down the ladder.
Yeah. I think within the Republican Party, there's no more, like the only person you can build around is Trump. That's why the speaker vote for him fails, because what's he going to do in the House? You want him to be president.
Well, I think that was I think Green had explicitly said that. Like, I don't want him to be third in line. I want him to be the president.
There you go. And then I'm not sure what else can be said about the Republican coalition at this point. I mean, we can talk about George Santos, but he is a demon of his own creation. I don't even.
Oh my god.
Maybe let's talk Santos. We're on Santos corner real quick.
Well, there is like one interesting thing about it, right? So like one of the things that they did get in the rules was kind of gutting the House Ethics Committee, which seemed to be largely to protect Santos and maybe a couple other people who are under investigation. Which again, it's like purely like this, like I don't know. I mean, like imagine like this is your response to like these ethics concerns in your like caucus is like, let's just gut the ethics committee. Like this is clearly like it would be like saying like, hey, there's footage of us like robbing this place, so we're going to defund the electricity for the cameras so we can just rob this place, without anyone seeing. Like it becomes like really transparent that there's issues as a result. But like Santos, like it's just, I mean, a lot of C-SPAN focus on him because he's sort of like, the talk of the hour. If it wasn't for McCarthy, right? Is this Santos. There's footage of him like not acknowledging when his name is called for the vote. I'm sure he just wasn't paying that close of attention. I know there's conspiracy theories that that's not even his real name. I would love for that to be true, but I feel like that's a bridge too far even for him. Though there's, I mean, what was the most recent thing, right? That he had lied about being like this all-star volleyball player, like
the newest lie to come out. That's the newest one.
That's just wild, right? Like that's like the most easily verifiable one, right? So he was the Nassau County Republican party chair. I don't know if that's where he's elected from, but they said that he's not allowed at their building. He's like they've disowned him because he's a disgrace in his lies. And then they mentioned this lie, which is like, this is the easiest thing to vouch, right? Like to vet, right? He said he went to this college. He went to this college and won a league championship. That has got to be like the easiest thing to like, oh, well, like when did this college win a championship? Like, oh, wait, Santos, which one's you? Like, you think that's like the easiest thing to do. Like, if I told you like, hey, I was the one who, got such and such team, their Super Bowl trophy. I was, I caught the winning touchdown. Like, you're not gonna believe that at face value.
Not at all. And now I'm just gonna look up George Santos's LinkedIn, because that's like the first thing you do when you're vetting somebody, right? Like, like nobody decided to look this dude's LinkedIn up. Okay, here we go.
Is it actually there?
I'm about to take a look. Nope, no idea who that is. That's Jersey anyways. Let's see. Okay, that is not him either. Let's just I'm just surprised that nobody decided to call up JP Morgan and be like, just to be clear, this guy worked for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what they eventually did, but again, like it was like after he was elected, and it's like again, like I mean, was there no opposition research? Did his like opponent just like say like, yeah,
His opponent shat the bed with Oppo research. Oh my god!
right? Like I mean, like just like the easiest stuff imaginable, and like again, like the dude just lied about everything. Like I mean, like you can imagine like the number of ads, right? If he's willing to lie about his employment, what else is he willing to lie about, right? Just the most
Right.
contrived stuff, but like just easy, surface level, and like nothing until after he's elected. And it's like, oh hey, like this guy, is like living a lie, or not even living a lie, I guess. Just like he's his entire existence is a lie.
That and just like I'm not gonna say that anyone in Congress acts like a normal person. First of all, you volunteer to run for office. There's something deeply diseased about that. But then, there's like
Hey,
a kind of
that's the height of civic service that you're talking about.
folks. Just because civic service is not on the DSM-5 doesn't mean we need to look into this as a society. But um, like you would think that like personability or at least like making small talk is one of those things that um you would learn to do or like you would try to do once you're elected to some kind of office.
Yeah.
Um and like the fact that he was just like sitting in the corner just staring at the camera basically. And the only person he seemed to talk to was Marjorie Taylor Greene, if anything.
Right. Well, and like there's like all those like pictures where he's like you could see him like trying to like huddle close to like wherever he perceives like the nexus of power to be in his caucus, right? Like he's like there next to like there's like the picture of like with like Gates and like the holdouts are like huddled together, and he's just like there in the background, like, oh yeah, I'm totally part of this, guys. Like, except he was voting McCarthy every time, so I don't dude, the guy is just like the definition of performative.
I'm pretty much, yeah, because like at this point, oh god, I can already see us like talking about performative shit in politics all year now. But like, given just how much of like both like liberal talking points and even conservatives to this point is like fulfilling a set expectation of things to say and ways to act.
Yeah.
You could begin to wonder like, okay, where does individual opinion or like dissent or like just uniqueness, where does that go? And at this point, right, like where we have the culture war instead of even like a defined partisan politics at this point, right? Santos
is it the defined partisan politics at this point though?
There you go, right? It's like I mean it's like Santos is the natural result of all this, right? Like of course you're going to be a guy who like does whatever it takes to hold the seat. And then once you have the seat, you vote for whoever gives you the right amount of dollars. I mean, the closest example I can think of is Kristen Sinema. Not at all for the same reasons, right? But Sinema has a weird checkered past of like being a self-identified anarchist, organizing for Occupy Wall Street, environmental organizing and stuff like that, right? And now like being a champion for moderation all of a sudden, right?
Well, and moderation's like the generous description of whatever
Exactly.
whatever you want to call what she champions. But like, yeah, I mean, it's really weird, right? Where it's like that's kind of yeah, I mean that is a good comparison, and it is weird, right? Where it's like they both kind of have like the same thing going for them, where like there's enough that's not right about them, that you question everything, right? You're like, well, like, was this, very left wing past, was that all just like a fabrication to get you into office? Like, I mean, like, that stuff happened, but like, was that purely going through the motions to like get a base of support before you stab them in the back? Right? That's the way it really comes across with her. And like Santos, like, again, like, the not answering to his name being called and people like speculating that that's not even his real name. Like, how many members, like, regardless of what you think of them, right? Like, no one is questioning that like Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually her name. Like, no one
Right.
is, no one's speculating that, or that AOC is her, like, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. No one's like, oh, is that really her name? Like, no one's questioning that. But the fact that this person is just like that much of a like committed liar, that people are like, maybe George Santos is just the name of the guy whose face he's wearing, right? Like, that's like, he literally like murdered some guy and like, is wearing like his face is like a mask, like, like, wild speculation that like he has given grounds to because of the fact that like nothing else he says is remotely true.
And this is exactly why, like, there is this like ongoing public debate about like exactly how conspiratorial should you be? How do you even approach that? Do you take the standard line or do you speculate freely? Stuff like that,
Well, I
right?
think that conversation is ended. I think we're just all
It's
like, we're all living in our own conspiracies at this point. Like,
I mean, at this point, yeah, there is no consensus reality. I agree with that. But then, like, what it goes to show is like public trust has been so low. What else are people going to think when stuff like this happens? Can
yeah,
you give people a reason to trust your system after that? And even earlier in this episode, we were talking about how like this vote could be seen as an example of like the system being put under duress and not being able to deal with it, right? I mean, how about let's look at it this way: is like the membership requirements at this point, uh, the rules are broken. You know what I'm saying? Like the fact that he got this far and everyone's like, okay, let's still try to proceed with this as it goes. I would think like in a sane society, if something got this far, someone would be like, okay, pack this shit up. We got to rewrite the Constitution if it got to this point.
right. Or at the very least, some of like the more low hanging fruit
Something
rules,
like,
right?
yeah.
Like, you'd think something would be done. But again, and like, we kind of, and I think that this is something that's not super new, but it's definitely been coming up more and more lately. Is that the problem with Congress is that it's kind of self-policed,
Hmm.
and when you're self-policed, and like, I mean, like, the whole reason why, like, I mean, like, again, like, Santos is being disowned by various like parts of the Republican Party, but like McCarthy is saying nothing because he was a loyal vote for him, right? It's like, because of the fact that he was willing to like come up to bat for him when 20 plus member, 20ish members weren't. He gets a free pass.
Hmm.
And it's not even really like a both sides issue, because it hasn't really been like, there's not really a good example of like anyone approaching this on like the Democratic side, right? I mean, look at the things that happened to and this has been a few years now, but someone like crap, who was the Michigan rep that had been there for a long time? Wasn't Dingle, it was,
Thaddeus McCotter, or is that who we're talking about?
no, who was it? He resigned because of like the Me Too stuff.
He was the Detroit congressman.
Yeah.
Um, God, how am I forgetting his name? I know everything about
Conyers.
that. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I was trying to like think of it, and I was like, do I need to look it up? I was like, no, it's John Conyers. Yeah, so like John Conyers forced out, more or less, right? Like, he, or even and this was one that I don't think was nearly as severe, and like compared to like all of these is practically innocent. Was someone like Al Franken, right? Like, the party polices them out because of
Yeah.
problematic features of accusations against them, things that have been documented about them, things like that, right? They're generally forced out. I mean, I know the right tries to make a a little bit of a sting with Eric Swalwell with his was he involved with some Chinese spy or something? But like,
Yeah, that was a funny one too.
yeah, it's so weird too because it's like it sounds like completely fictitious, but like it like I mean it happened, but it was resolved.
Well, I mean,
But
for
like,
crying out loud, Jim Jordan has just horrible shit under his belt, right? And
right?
he even got nominated for the speaker role.
Yeah, and it was said that he had he had demonstrated himself as the perfect candidate for the speaker.
I mean, again, Hastert
I
said
buy
it
a guy
yesterday.
who's accused of sex trafficking, so like, I mean,
Oh God.
and again too, and it's like like, and I was actually surprised. It was on CNN, so maybe it wasn't as surprised. But I was surprised that they actually noted like when they're like, oh well, like Republicans they elected like Dennis Hastert on the first round, and like Jake Tapper's like, yeah, and he was a child molester. Um, but like that stuff didn't come out till after the fact, anyways. And even then, like his sentence was like, I mean, the dude was in prison for like 13 months. Like, was that like a month per child? Like, I mean, like a
I'm
slap on the wrist.
surprised. I'm not trying to be dark here, but I'm surprised he did any time at all, given like. I
Well,
mean,
he wasn't in Congress at the time, but still, I mean, clearly another example of like and we see a lot of discussion about it, the idea of having a two-tier justice system, and like
yeah,
it
yeah.
certainly exists. I don't think it exists along the political lines necessarily. I think it exists, across more of like class or
Proximity to power,
professional
really.
lines,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's that's where it really exists. But I wouldn't really say it's I know that there's like kind of this push of like oh like we gotta hold Joe Biden accountable for these like 10 documents that we discovered that were
Oh
classified
dear
versus
God, that shit is also just stupid to me. It's like, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the American obsession with who did the more evil thing has always bugged me. You know what I mean? Like, there's barely a
yeah.
consistent standard for punishment for doing the thing. Why are we arguing for like over like who did it worse?
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's because it kind of descends to two things. One, I've seen it like kind of descend into like just like kind of like both sides nihilism, where it's like everyone sucks, therefore I'm just gonna like close myself off. Which I think sometimes that is taken to an extreme and whatnot. But then there's the
And
other side.
I'll admit I'm guilty of that. I'll admit it.
Right, yeah, and I think like it's fine being guilty of it at times, but like I think like it's like one of those things where it's just like it's hard to have a productive conversation
Right.
when you have like that sort of mindset. And then of course there's the side where it's like, well, um, this person did this, but that person did that. I'm going to emphasize only that thing, right? And
Exactly,
like
exactly.
I think like again with the Biden thing versus like Trump's situation, they are completely different. Yes, there's classified documents involved, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. But again, it's just like hilarious where it's like you could tell that like they're just desperate for anything to like impeach him. And again, like these people who are like kind of the intellectual leaders of the Republican Party in Congress, which sounds bizarre to say, but like they're the ones who are like sort of the forward facing thing, right? They're the ones who McCarthy seems to be like, I have to keep them somewhat happy to maintain power, whatever power means, right? It seems to be more symbolic for him than it seems to be anything tangible or anything he can actually exercise. Um, and like it's going to be costly, right? I mean, like if they're like, oh, we're going to impeach Biden for like the fact that he had 10 documents, right? The public's not going to buy that. They're going to be like, look at these guys. We elected them, and all they're going to do, or like, oh, here's the select committee on the contours of Hunter Biden's penis.
Right.
Like all of these like silly performative things that like I'm sure members of their base are satisfied with it, but the general public isn't.
Yeah, because who is? I mean, I'm saying this kind of cynically, but also earnestly, right? Is like, as you know, of course, the Benghazi investigations were to damage Hillary Clinton's presidential prospects more than it was getting her in trouble, right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you think they would have even charged her if she did come up guilty? Do you really think that? And I'm not really trying to spread like a narrative here. This is just me like observing trends and just like thinking about this two-tier justice system we were mentioning, right? Do you really think they would throw one of their own under the bus?
I think that's actually interesting that you mentioned it because, like, because I think, like, I mean, the party's changed a little bit since then, right? I mean, I think it's definitely gotten a little bit more vitriolic, but like, because there's the political argument for what you do, right? You know, like on one hand, it's like this is your hated enemy. Of course, you're gonna fry them, right? Yeah, like she's sort of one of us, but I don't think the political class even necessarily sees the same level of unity as they may once have, right? But at the same time, it's like, well, here's like all of this Oppo research. She's a really weak candidate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should just let her like get off, scot free because we've got this completely compromised candidate, right? And like I've seen even some arguments from Democrats for doing the same thing with Trump, right? Like, yeah, he's like horribly corrupt. He's done like everything and like every bad thing in the book, but if he runs and wins, he's gonna be the easiest guy to beat. And they even said that the first time around, right? And that look how that panned out. Um, and like, and that's the problem too, right? It's like when there's political incentives to even let like these are the only people who are going to hold you accountable, right? Because they're not necessarily one of your own. But the fact that there's political incentives to, not do anything just further enshrines that justice system, right? And I mean, I'm sure there's divide and debate within like, the parties over what to do. But, it just leaves like it's problematic.
I think the one thing in all of this, right, is that if you set a precedent, for example, that any president would have to go to jail for something you could charge them for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think any president who's been elected in the past 20 years wouldn't also go to jail?
If we adopt that principle and just apply it unilaterally, they're all in jail.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and that's that's in the international context, right? That's why we don't join the the ICC, right? The International Criminal Court is because we commit war crimes. Obama committed war crimes. Clinton committed war crimes. Bush committed war crimes. Trump did. Biden probably has. Maybe a little less because he hasn't been around quite as long as the others. But like they all have, right? Like pretty much ever since we entered the world stage, we've all committed levels of war crime pretty much since the ICCs exist, and that's why we're not part of it because we don't want to be liable for anything, even if it wouldn't necessarily be enforced, right? It's it's bad for PR when you do that, right? I mean, no one. I mean, look at how little like we've talked about drone warfare since the Obama years,
right?
Like all this stuff that was once hot button discussions, like they kind of fade, and I think part of it too is like Americans, I think, are against. I think they've grown weary of like conflict where like it involved like sending soldiers. I don't think that they're necessarily as adverse to comparatively costless conflict, at least in terms of losses to like themselves and like their own conveniences. Whereas like drone warfare enables like you to
That's
do
the
that.
whole
Right?
pitch of it, exactly, is that
Yeah.
we don't have to send anyone over. We can just do it remotely. Allegedly.
Yeah. Except you still need boots on the ground for some reason. I mean, like there's I don't know. I'm not gonna get into a whole strategic army discussion. I feel like I might have a little bit more of value to contribute than Elon Musk and his take on tanks, but I'm certainly no military expert.
I guess like yeah, well, the biggest theme in our discussion on all of this, because we did like kind of hit this for like about an hour or so, is there is no cost to being honest in this business, but there's definitely no benefit. Whether you're the president or whether you're in the House.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's. I don't know. It's like one of those things. I mean, I think the cost to being honest is I guess political brownie points and whatnot. And I mean that's it's kind of like one of those things that we've always kind of accused politicians of, and it's kind of become back in vogue recently.
Well, on that note, I will announce that we now have a set of standards in place for the greenhouse seal of endorsement for a candidate. And the minimum requirement is that you will serve one term as long as you're allowed, and you're just going to act reckless the entire fucking time. Like, my new threshold for like a member of Congress is like, I'm just going to be there for 2 years. I'm wasting no time on fundraising.
Oh
I'm
my
going to
god.
be making a ruckus in every committee I get appointed to. Even if the committee's dog shit, I'm just going to be like doing reckless shit.
Oh man.
Because like again, like I don't know if the correct term is progressive ambition. That's what was told to me in my Congress and legislative process class. But the idea of like, consistently advancing to the next higher office.
Yeah, that's usually the term we use.
Okay. So like the whole pitch of progressive ambition to voters is that, you support this person through their career, and whatever goals they said they were going to start with are the ones they're going to continue to accomplish at each higher level, right? But I don't know how else you're going to get anyone other than George Santos and the George Santosification of politics beyond this point.
The
You may have
George
heard about
Santosification of
you may have
politics,
heard about
man.
bimbofication, but let's talk about George Santosification.
Oh man. Is that like just like a mask off version of like what we've had for? I mean, I don't know. I don't think I don't like. I mean, obviously politicians lie and they kind of mislead you to like advance in a lot of cases, right? I'm not gonna like pretend that's not the case, but like he definitely takes it to a new level.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like progressive ambition, like it's interesting, and actually there was a couple recent things that came out with that I thought was kind of um interesting because there's like, and I was going to use this as a current event in my class tomorrow. Was so like Debbie Stabenow, our senator, is retiring. I don't think anyone's announced yet, but what I did find interesting was that Dianne Feinstein, who will be 92 or 91, I think, when 2024 rolls around, has not announced retirement and has already had 2 members say they want to fill her seat.
I'm wondering who she's holding the seat for, right?
Herself. I don't think she's like
Or who's like incentivizing this to continue to be the case. You know what I'm saying? Because like I'm not sure if such a procedure exists. Actually, no, there is none, right? Even if your party wants you out,
oh,
the
I
whole
mean,
body has to dismiss or censure you, right?
yeah, like there's the full body expulsion. And then, like I don't think like I don't think you're gonna get like Republicans voting like against expulsion because they're like, oh no, like you gotta keep her. But like, yeah, there's not like great, and there's no like recall petitions either in Congress either. Not that I'm necessarily, not that I'm not that it would necessarily happen for her. Um, but it's like it's one of those things that again you just don't really have that option, and I think it's problematic, especially in the Senate, right? When it's like 6 years, like
Right.
you're the closest thing to a recall position. This is a little bit morbid, is a bullet. Um, or for your party, like again, like there's no precedent of them calling out a hit on a member of Congress, but
That we know of.
yeah, that we know of. But that's
Wink,
like
wink, nudge, nudge.
but yeah, like that's like there's and that would probably require a constitutional adaptation, right? But again, it's like one of those things where we just don't have a good recourse for issues. And like I just like I googled an image, I Google image searched her before this, and I was shocked by what I had seen. I highly recommend that you do so right now because
I'm okay. Let's pull it up. I mean,
like I know she's old, but wow.
if we ever do like the podcast as a video, it's just gonna be like my browser tabs as we're recording these episodes, right? But oh god, let's take a look. This is elder abuse. Why is this happening? Why is this allowed to happen?
I take it you saw what I found.
I just, man,
And I mean, she's someone of like I don't know. I mean, like she has like an interesting legacy, right? Because I think she's in the past few years has definitely come across as incredibly out of touch, but she had a meaningful role in the institution, right? I
right.
think she supported a number of good initiatives. She helped kind of lift the veil on like the torture programs and stuff like that during the war on terror and things like that. But yeah, like this is someone who needs to go. That's really old. And I know some people like, before, like I've seen on Twitter discourse where it's like, oh, what about Chuck Grassley? Like, yeah, obviously like Chuck Grassley, I mean, he was just elected. He probably shouldn't be there either, but like I don't have any influence in that space that would actually, get him removed from Congress. Like, you know, he's there because he's a Republican and they're fine with that. Like, good for them. I mean, he'll probably die in office if I had to guess.
Yeah,
Um,
that's also interesting that I don't know, like if there's two people who want that seat, what role could possibly be like construed by her like holding the seat? And then just to tie this back to the earlier thread about Debbie Stabenow retiring and the Michigan seat being open. I haven't seen any prominent Michigan officials declare that they want to run either.
well, exactly, and I mean, like, it seems. I think
Andy
the general.
Levin was an ask, and he basically like came out in blue, said "fuck this, I'm out."
Yeah, that's the thing is a lot of them have just said no, right? Whitmer said no. I think Benson. Crap, who was the other one? Dingle said no. I mean, granted that not exactly passing the torch to the next generation there. Um, but the speculation seems to be, at least as far as Democrats are concerned, it's probably going to be Slotkin. But again, she hasn't formally announced, and it's just interesting, right? That like Debbie announces a very clear intention. I mean, her statement literally was like, "I'm inspired by a new generation of leaders, and I want to pass the torch." Right? Very clear. I mean, I think very clearly responding to the election results too, right? Where like Democrats did well statewide. She's assuming that one will fill her seat. A number of Republican names I've seen floated around. I mean, this is like a weird gallery. You've got like Peter Meyer, who lost, John James, who did win barely, but has lost the Senate seat twice, Candace Miller, of course, Tudor Dixon, and Fred Upton, who is, again, like, not exactly passing the torch in the next generation. Of course, for Democrats, I mean, there's also the possibility of one Peter Buttigieg.
Now that he's a Michigan resident, true.
Yes.
If he runs, if it's between, here's the thing. My nightmare scenario is Pete Buttigieg, Alyssa Slotkin, and Sri Tanadar.
Oh my God.
Buttigieg, and here's the thing: it's 3 CIA assets up against each other. I don't know if I want to. I really don't know if I want to vote in that primary, man.
Well, Sri had like preemptively come out and said he wasn't going to run for it.
Thank God! Oh, thank God!
Which is funny because like it's like someone's like, who asked? I'm like, to be fair, I did want to know that he.
I did want to know. I was really worried
like,
he was gonna.
It's like I wanted to know that like. I wanted this to be safe, that he was not gonna, it's bad enough he's in the House. I didn't want him in the Senate. Where he just gets there by out, like, quote unquote, out fundraising everyone. More like just outspending everyone, though. Clearly, fundraising isn't the end all be all, given that the Stacey Abrams campaign accrued a rather impressive debt.
Oh my God! If it is Buttigieg versus Slotkin, man, I might have to nominate someone as a write-in.
The other
we
one
got to run an anti-CIA slate, man.
I've seen Mallory McMorrow floated as well. I don't know how likely I see that.
That's a big jump, though, from like state Senate to U.S. Senate.
Yeah, that's a pretty big jump. I mean, the more likely outcome. I don't know if the districts even line up for this, but like I more so see it as likely that she would like take Slotkin's seat. if anything, like in the House.
That's fair.
But again, I don't know if the districts quite line up.
Also, not that I missed your riff or anything, but speaking to what you were saying earlier about Stacey Abrams, dear God, dear fucking God.
It's so she's such a weird political figure, right? Where it's like she was popular in like kind of like this online sense,
Yeah,
leading to her. Did she run for governor or was it attorney general the first time?
as far as I know, she ran twice for governor of Georgia, and the first time she lost against Brian Kemp, there was
Yeah,
it was during that big 2018 anti-Trump wave, if I recall
yeah,
correctly. And there was that big thing about Kemp being the Secretary of State for Georgia.
yeah. And there was a
So,
lot of like voter suppression in Georgia.
yes, yes.
Um,
Just in
and
general in the South, but yes.
Yeah, but like in Georgia in particular was kind of highlighted by like that, and so there was a lot of enthusiasm for her, at least in like an online sense, right? I don't, I wasn't there on the ground in Georgia. I didn't follow, Georgia politics that well. I do know a few scholars who
Well,
followed her race closely, but
so the other thing about Abrams then is like she was able to position herself as the get people registered to vote figure.
yeah,
And after Warnock and John Ossoff both win in Georgia, I'm not sure if she necessarily jumped in to do this, but there was definitely like this political media push to like present her as
the
this is
reason that they won,
yes, the
yeah,
reason that they won, right? Now, maybe she does have an organizing capacity. I really didn't study the organization she was part of. What
hmm
I do know is she was raising a lot of money. Now,
yeah,
fundraising gets you places in politics. We're aware of this.
hmm
What are they doing with those sums of money? That's the devil's in those details. And I can't say I know a lot. But incurring
yeah,
a
and then
debt, that's weird.
yeah, and like so in 2022, she apparently raised more than 113 million dollars, but went into 1.4 million in debt. Um, and like it's kind of one of those things too, where like I don't think it's I don't I've seen people like refer to her as a grifter. I think that's probably too harsh. Like I don't see her in like the same light that I see some of um like who was the guy that ran against Bobert? Like he didn't make it through the primary, like
I know
Walker or
who
something.
the TikTok guy. I know who you're
Yeah, the
talking about.
TikTok guy, the gay guy who's gonna take Bobert down was how he had like advertised
And he
himself.
positioned himself as this like anti-socialist candidate or something. I recall something like
Yes,
that. I
and he
recall
didn't
something.
make it through the primary, but like, and it hit. And like, there's a few on the Republican side as well who did this, where they like all of their ads were targeting the opposite party incumbent, and like they didn't make it through their their primary, so it was like wasted effort. But yeah, like it's like he was kind of like one of those people where like raised a whole bunch of money because he's running against Bobert. And Marjorie Taylor's Greene opponent, same deal, right? Raises a lot of
Right.
money because he's running against a lunatic. Um, and like I don't want to say that like Abrams like belongs in that same vein, but at the same time, it's like, and I've seen like a certain group of people in like the political class, and like by political class, I'm more so referring to like poll watchers, like voters who are maybe a little bit more engaged with the process, right?
Right, right.
Where it's like, well, if she had $1 million more, she probably would have won. And it's like there's diminishing return. Like it is true that like usually the candidate with more money wins.
But didn't
For the most
Trump
part.
break that rule? Because like I recall like that was almost
Well, I
an
mean,
iron
there's
law.
a lot of people have broken that rule,
Okay, that's
right?
what I
Like,
thought. Yeah, yeah.
like I think even crap, who was it that ran against McConnell last time? Like she outraised him.
Are you talking about Alison Grimes or?
Yeah, like was it Grimes last time or
Well, I mean, Booker and Grimes have both run against McConnell, but I think it
yeah, it
was
was whoever the last one was,
then
right?
it was
Like
Booker. It
they
was Booker. Yeah, yeah.
okay, yeah, so like they outraised him, but they still lost, and it's like at a certain point there's a diminishing, there's diminishing returns on money. Obviously, I mean, like probably the best example, right? I mean, like obviously we did say like Trump has had that problem, but probably the best example is our boy Michael Bloomberg. Just a ton of money. I mean, and just completely thrown down the drain. And all he has to show for it is winning the Democratic primary in American fucking Samoa. Like,
which is a Republican territory, pretty much. Like Republican politics tends to dominate there.
Yeah, and like he beat this is more so I think because of like her own like ethnic ties more so than like her politics. But like, he beat Tulsi Gabbard there. That was second place. But like again, like it's a primary where like there's like a couple delegates in play. Like that was it. That's all he had to show for himself. And like I remember the way, and I mean the way he was spending his money was also moronic. And I don't necessarily know if that's comparable in like the Abrams case or not. But like the way he was spending his money, I know, for instance, that he had he wasn't spending any in like the early primary states.
Well, the thing about
which were like the ones that were seen as like the most important.
the only legitimate goal, if the Bloomberg campaign had one, and they'll never admit to this, right? Is and again, I'm not relitigating 2020. This is just something that I believe to be true. Is that Bloomberg came in to basically wreck some of the early enthusiasm for Bernie. I think that's the only reason he ran. But in Abrams' case,
well, I think Warren too. I mean, I think we do kind of forget there was some enthusiasm for her as well, but it was it was there to challenge both of them.
Pretty much. I don't think Bloomberg had any intent to actually win the office. Hell, he has enough money to be more powerful than the president, right? So
right, yeah,
that's a moot point. But with Abrams, right? I get, like the point about her not being a grifter. I agree with that pretty much. The reason why is like fundraising is the establishment in the Democratic Party. If we want to actually formalize it, right? Like Pelosi's concrete ability to raise funds for the party, set people up with fundraisers, set people up with money, is the reason she held the cards that long in the House, right?
Yeah.
And Abrams coming in as like the new fundraiser on the scene and being able to play that up to try to ingratiate herself deeper in the party. Now, was she able to get a VP spot with Biden out of it? We saw that not happen. Her ability to win elections is definitely in dispute. But I think like, is it grifting? Not necessarily, insofar as fundraising has always worked like this. I think a lot of people are just starting to realize fundraising is a grift by design.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, and I think that it's. I don't know if there's quite the recognition that fundraising as a whole is a grift. I think that there's kind of.
Of course, there isn't. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Like they're emphasizing it on like a few candidates, and I think some of them like absolutely right. Like it's like money's not going to really make a huge difference, and like I've seen some people suggest, and I don't necessarily know in her case. Like I think the general people, I think there's generally more goodwill towards her than some other candidates, where like there's the idea that she might be building like a long-term organization in terms of like Georgia Democratic voters that has long-term repercussions beyond just her race. But I don't see that the case for like a lot of these people, where it's like very much like it's about them. It's not about like party building or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's like, again, progressive ambition does play into this to some extent.
Yeah,
you could probably pitch that, what Abrams is doing is like an alternative to the traditional model of progressive ambition, where instead of seeking the next highest office, because I think she was in
any office.
Yeah, she went from Georgia State House to seeking. Yeah, just ingratiate yourself into the party apparatus as a fundraiser, and then see if there's a way to use media clouds to spin that into another race. If not that, you'll definitely show up in Star Trek. And you'll have the admiration of like a very online parasocial cohort of liberal, but that's really all she's been able to spin out of it.
I mean, hey, we're not in Star Trek, so I guess that's something for her, right?
Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean, like it's kind of sad. Where like I don't know. I mean, like I definitely don't think she's necessarily like someone who I think there's like, or at least there was like a disturbing level of admiration for her that I think like bordered on some, you know, problematic views maybe. And we're
Right,
just in
right.
like the sense like I don't think like turning like support of a political candidate should be your personality or like even maybe your premier form of political engagement. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's a point we've touched on before, but you're 100% right there. But yeah, I think the over under is like Stacey Abrams is not a new kind of evil; it's more of an existing kind, if that makes
yeah,
sense. Okay, so we've been at this for about an hour and a half. The only other topic that I was able to get on the outline, and we've actually covered a lot more than the scope of our outline than we intended. So, once again, I said I was going to go on hiatus in January, and we're actually delivering solidly for you folks. Um,
look at that. That wasn't self-deprecating at all. Good on you.
I left that last year. I left that last year, folks. Folks, this is a free show. We will continue to deliver quality, accessible content, uh, as long as we can. So, the one thing that I was wondering this year, given just the period of the year we're in, right, is like
Hmm.
January 6th was a weird event. It didn't really repeat itself.
Well, you're only born once.
You're only exactly. Yeah, that is my birthday, but I mean, I was referring to the oh god, the 2021 Capitol riot,
Yeah,
and part right, and part of me was just part of me always wonders like, what if it came back, and we could have the same amount of just funny shit to say about it as we also just observe like the system collapse in the saddest way, right? And I had like a bit of a bad feeling, like I'm gonna cue the clip from Star Wars. I got a bad feeling about this. Um, but part of me was just like, what if this happened again? Like, w- how would you even deal with something that stupid happening again, right? And the expression came to my mind. It happens first as tragedy, then as farce. And I'm
hmm.
speaking about the knockoff Brazilian Capitol riot that happened on the 8th.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not even joking about it. I'm not even joking about it being a knockoff. It was literally the same kind of goal. They even had a knockoff Q shaman. The same goals of basically trashing the Brazilian Congress building. Um,
There was less of the I mean, I don't necessarily know enough about their direct goals. Like, I assume like they had the same intentions overall, but like, it was like a key difference here is that Congress was not in session at the time,
yes,
whereas before or the January 6th here, right, the idea was intervening with that vote, and that the belief would be that that would prevent the swearing in or the confirmation of a new president. Um, Here it's a little different. It's kind of more so like I wouldn't necessarily say more so like a traditional violent protest. Like that sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but
yeah, because it's not like January 6th was a traditional violent protest either. You know what I mean? So
yeah. But I mean, very clearly inspired by it, right? I mean, they used the
yeah,
same tactics, organized on social media. Part of that, kind of boiled down to. I mean, they used a number of WhatsApp and other things as well, but in particular, Twitter. Notably, Musk had fired most of the Brazilian staff, so uh, there was poor monitoring and prevention of this. That being said, I do think the crackdown in the aftermath of this, like I'm sure, like they might have tried to prevent it from happening altogether, but um, they arrested over 400 people. or I think late after the riot, over 1,000 people have been arrested. Like there seems to be a much more serious crackdown on this. There is a push for Biden to extradite the former Brazilian president Bolsonaro, who is very much like, I mean, again, like, continuing the parallels, Bolsonaro was very much, the South American Trump, right? I mean, that was always the
and that's not
comparison
an
with him.
exaggeration at all.
No,
And
it's not. Like that's always, there's a reason that that's been the comparison, right? And again, he lost to Lula, and he's immediately almost immediately fled to Florida. I think is currently in the hospital after experiencing some illness. I believe the undisclosed, possibly the same thing that Diamond of Diamond and Silk fame has endured. Hard to say, but the yeah, like, I mean, it's like January 6th and everything but name and the date, right? It's there's a few differences. As I said, Congress wasn't in session. I mean, maybe that makes it slightly less bad. I don't know, but I mean, I think a key difference here, and you have a future episode planned with an interview, kind of delving into this in more detail. With
yes,
someone who's,
there is an upcoming interview.
I would assume, more qualified to just talk about this than me, as someone who's not necessarily a Brazilian expert, not an expert on the event, but yeah, this is very much like their January 6th. I do think, though, one of the key differences is, I think, the seriousness for which the aftermath has been taken, right? The number of arrests, the crackdown, a kind of a far cry from here, right? Where not to like undermine anything like that the January 6th committee attempted, but like they roll out stuff when pretty much it's like, yeah, Congress is done, this session's done, this committee is almost certainly not going to survive into the next Congress. Here's our report. They took a really, and I mean, like, obviously, like, I'm sure there's going to be lengthy investigations of this as well in Brazil, but the lack of really like a strong immediate pushback, I think, is problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's like the one thing that people have noted is, unlike the United States, where this was just like a weird thing to observe passively, kind of react to on your own, at your own discretion, the Brazilian authorities have pretty much taken it seriously. And just like, I do
wonder one thing, though, and this is maybe a little less serious. The guy who was selling cotton candy, do you think he got arrested?
I hope he didn't. It's like the guy. It's the same as the guy in DC who, like, when the Capitol was being stormed, immediately printed out 50 Q shirts and started selling them. Like, okay, maybe that's grifting, but at the same time, like, if you're trying to hustle like that, we got to respect it just a little bit. Not a lot, but at least a little bit.
I mean, I can't say, like, if I was in the same situation with the same means, that I wouldn't have attempted to sort of, let's make some money out of this. I don't know if cotton candy would have been my approach, but like, do you think he just happened to have, like, is that just his day job? And he's like, hey, there's a lot of people. Like,
I mean, like, again, I'm not sure how similar Brazil is to India, right? But like, that happens a lot in India, where, like, for subsistence, people do sell like shit just to like get by, right? So hawking is like a common profession and shit. So like, I'm not sure if it's the exact same economic forces in Brazil, but the guy kind of just looked like he was just trying to get by. He didn't really care that they were there for that. He was just like, okay, you guys look like you got money. Just buy this shit and let me get out of here. I do not see him as the aggressor in this situation.
Oh no, yeah, I mean, but yeah, I mean, I said, like, it's hopefully he got off scot free, but everyone, the actual aggressors, I mean, like, again, and of course, like, the same people here, right, are sort of that have kind of obfuscated January 6th. I mean, I think there's a little bit more of like kind of just the usual American style, like, anytime something bad happens in our country, we kind of express sympathies, but don't really take steps to prevent it from happening in ours and stuff like that. Like, I mean, there's a few right wingers who've done that, except for Tucker Carlson. He's shameless. He's full on,
right,
embracing of the the grift, right? To just you know, do whatever he wants. Um, yeah, I mean that's kind of the big takeaway there. I do think, and like it's one of those things. I think this is kind of a general thing, and it's been a theme of a few things on this show where we've, the United States, and I think people in the United States tend to have like this kind of main character syndrome problem
Right.
where we just kind of like, and like here, right, like, oh, it's their January 6th, right? It's like they're copycats. And, like sometimes that's not warranted. I think here it definitely is. Um, it's definitely like designed, again, like Bolsonaro is the Brazilian Trump, and like it's a apt comparison for a number of reasons, and like naturally, like his supporters are kind of inspired by like what happened here, and like probably saw like the level of there's definitely, I mean, like I wouldn't say that we've just kind of entirely moved on from January 6th, but I think the repercussions of it have definitely been far less severe than they had any reason being, and I'm sure that they kind of followed suit, and maybe in part in accordance to that.
I mean, I agree with that, right? And that's the biggest shock of this event to me, right? Is that, we've talked a lot about the United States as an exporter of violence to the rest of the world, right?
Mhm.
As an exporter of neoliberalism and as an exporter of just all these bad things. But I think the thing about the Trump brand is like this disputed quality of its fascism, right? Is it alleged or is it real? Is it a ersatz stupid version of it, or is it sincere? But I think the thing that got downplayed in the early days of the Trump presidency, that I think might be worth bringing back up now, is that it was seen also as a global invigoration of the far right as a whole. When Trump went up, so too did Bolsonaro. And, we can dispute whether or not Trump is personally a fascist. I can say it out loud. Bolsonaro was a right-wing paramilitary. He explicitly took, joy in persecuting leftists.
Mm-hmm.
And as made visible and verbal threats to people. That's the kind of guy he is. Now, it's also very pathetic and funny to watch him kind of flounder pathetically the way that Trump does, because that's, I mean,
When I will say that I think his response to his electoral defeat too, like I do know this much, like there was a it's I think it's in some ways more Trump-like than I think people expected, because I think people expected that he would go the more like hard fascist route of like cute election results. I don't give a shit.
And so he kind of flees to Florida. Now, granted, was he doing it to escape consequences? That remains to be determined. But
that continues the parallel too, right? Fleeing to Florida.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. And even then, like outside of Bolsonaro too, you had, I mean, Janine Áñez in Bolivia. Granted, her tenure was short-lived and she got imprisoned, but that was another resurgence of the right. You had Le Pen try to compete against Macron in France. Even this new neo-fascist we have in Italy, right?
Yeah.
This is like an aftershock of the Trump epicenter in a way. And there could be a dispute about, like, is the neo-fascist variety of politics we're seeing, how sincere is it? How dangerous is it? How accurate is it to call it that? Who's to say, of course. But one thing's for certain, they like Trump. They like this brand of Trump because for whatever reason, Trump is the culture war. He is the alternative to liberalism in these people's eyes. Just him existing. I don't know how that came to be, and like again, it's a pathetic ideology. We both don't need to dispute this. Fascism is a pathetic ideology. it is a way to aggrandize yourself because you feel shitty and you take out all your inhumanity on people you deem lesser. That's why they do it. But it also is just pathetic intellectually that you're willing to just organize around this feckless, um, insipid dolt who can't even deliver anything for you in a practical political sense, just because he validates you. And
Well, yeah, I think that's. I mean, on some level, I think that's kind of like what people get out of politics in general, right? Is they kind of
right,
seek for like where are they most validated, and like if he at least identifies the problems in the way that you think that the are the source of those problems, right? Not to say that they're accurate, but like if you think that the issue is like a supposed quote unquote open border or whatever, like whatever the specific policies of Bolsonaro or some of the other kind of copycats are, um that like it's good enough for some people, right? And
yeah,
we see that on kind of all sides of this political aisle, right? Is just at least like talking the talk is good enough for a lot of people, and they kind of, and some of it's kind of a result of a little bit of privilege and whatnot, being able to sort of live consequence free of some of that, or some of it is just maybe some level of ignorance and not like knowing better that they can actually solve the things that they claim to
right.
through those methods.
But yeah, you're willing to sacrifice the rest of the world's on the altar of your self validation, and that to me is pathetic and ironically hilarious because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, Trump is. I'm not even trying to go lib mode here. It's just like Trump is kind of a pathetic guy when you see him talk. Bolsonaro's always in the hospital every 3 weeks. Like, these are your heroes?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just like, or your Andrew Tates of the world who are
Fuck that guy. Oh
arrested for
my fucking
for
god.
sex trafficking and stuff like that. I mean, it's just like it's yeah.
Yeah, it's just in summary, like I don't know. I try to be nice, but at the same time, like these are contemptible ideologies and these are contemptible actions taken in the names of those ideologies, and they're not
Yeah.
worth keeping. They're really not worth keeping. So there will be an upcoming interview where I will have a guest on to discuss the events of this Capitol riot, as well as the political situation in Brazil, as well as the Cuban expat scene in Florida and how that pertains to the right wing turn. But that will come out later. Um, Josh, do you have any other thoughts on everything we've spoken about today? I know we ran the gamut.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of got out all the key things I wanted to say. Um, it'll be interesting. I mean, I think that like again, like the house stuff's a little bit closer to home, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how long this turmoil lasts. If it's a symptom of I guess things in this Congress, and if it's a symptom of stuff beyond, right? I mean, I don't think that it's kind of I think there's been this general take when it comes to kind of empowering some of these far right wing members that you sort of kind of let the genie out of the bottle, and you can't really stuff it back in, right? It's difficult to close Pandora's box, and I think McCarthy is going to find that's going to be true of his speakership. Whether or not it transpires past that, I guess, kind of remains to be up in the air. But it definitely doesn't seem like it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, it's still too early to predict where this could go, but we've seen enough to worry, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I got nothing else. I think we thoroughly exhausted this outline here, which means, this went well. Um, so thanks again for coming on, Josh. Where can people find you if they want more of you?
Well, as always, I'm on Twitter at JoshuaCoss17, and I am also on another podcast, the MonsterPop podcast, where we talk about pro wrestling and occasionally its intersections with politics, but usually those are incidental and not necessarily the point of the show, but sometimes it becomes like I am the host of two political shows, so we'll see.
Yeah, sometimes those intersections come through crazy. Those are fun.
Yeah. Well, there's some fun stuff with Saudi Arabia coming out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll
I'll definitely include the links to Monster Pop and your socials in the episode description. You can follow the show on Twitter at @PodGreenhouse. And I'll include the links to all our other socials in the description as well. If you'd like to support the show at this time, all we ask is that, you provide us a review and some feedback on Apple Podcasts. If you'd rather not, send us a DM, send us an email. Give us some episode ideas or things you'd like us to cover. If you got any questions, we're happy to answer those.
Well, that attitude's not going to let us fill that 1.4 million campaign debt we're in.
Yeah, well, I didn't run up that debt. Oh, that's all I'll say. But until then, thanks again for listening, dear listeners. We're looking forward to another exciting year with you guys and gals and everyone. Keep it inclusive, folks. But until then, we'll see you next episode. Take care.